If you have diabetes, prediabetes, or you are simply trying to stop your blood sugar from swinging like a door in a storm, what I'm about to tell you may completely change what sits in your pantry tonight. Because the flour you trust, the one with the healthy label, the brown bag, the words natural or multigrain printed across the front, may still be pushing your glucose much higher than you realize. And the flour most people think is safest? In many kitchens, it is not even close. By the end of this video, you'll know which flour I recommend most often, which ones can still work, and the hidden mistake that ruins even the best choice. I'm Dr. Luna Ellison, and after years of helping older adults control blood sugar, I can tell you this with complete honesty. Flour is one of the most misunderstood foods in diabetes nutrition. People are terrified of sugar, but they keep eating finely ground starch that behaves almost like sugar the moment it hits the bloodstream. And then they wonder why their morning reading looked reasonable, but after breakfast their numbers suddenly shot up. The problem isn't always bread itself. Sometimes it's the kind of flour, sometimes it's the amount, and sometimes it's the healthy swap you were promised would save you, but never actually could. Before we begin, please subscribe to my channel, support our mission, and help more families find simple, life-saving health advice. Now let me say something important before anyone in the comments gets upset. There is no magical flour that gives you unlimited permission to bake, stack, spread, toast, and snack without consequences. That flour does not exist. Every flour has context. Every flour has portion size. Every flour behaves differently depending on what you mix it with, how finely it's ground, and how much of it you eat. So when I say best flour, I do not mean consequence-free. I mean the option that tends to create the gentlest blood sugar response when used properly and in sensible amounts. That distinction matters more than most people understand. Let me tell you about Gloria, age 72, because her story reveals the trap almost perfectly. Gloria had worked hard to lower her. She stopped soda, cut desserts, gave up late-night candy, and switched from white bread to homemade brown muffins made with a flour blend labeled wholesome grain goodness. She felt proud. She felt disciplined. She believed she was doing everything right. Then her glucose after breakfast kept climbing into numbers that scared her. She blamed fruit. She blamed stress. She even blamed the monitor. But when we looked closely, the real problem was the flour blend. It was still mostly refined starch, dressed up with a healthier-looking label. That is the first truth you need to understand. Flour is not judged by color. It is not judged by packaging. It is not judged by words like rustic, farmhouse, ancient, artisan, or stone-inspired. It is judged by what it actually does in your body. And the body is not fooled by marketing. Your bloodstream does not care if the bag is beige and covered in pictures of wheat fields. If a flour is heavily refined, low in fiber, low in protein, and easy to digest quickly, your blood sugar can rise fast. Sometimes not because you overate, but because you thought you had chosen something safe when you really had not. So how do doctors and dietitians think about flour for diabetes? We look at three things. First, how much digestible carbohydrate it brings to the meal. Second, what slows that carbohydrate down, meaning fiber, protein, and healthy fat. And third, how processed it is. The more refined and finely milled a carbohydrate is, the faster it often acts. That's why white flour tends to hit differently than a flour that still carries more natural structure, more fiber, or more protein. This is exactly why some flours can fit into a diabetes-friendly plan, while others create those fast spikes that leave you tired, hungry, and frustrated 2 hours later. Let me make this simple. Imagine two fires. One is a dry pile of paper. The other is a thick log. Refined flour behaves more like the paper. It catches quickly. The glucose rises fast. A higher fiber or higher protein flour behaves more like the log. It burns slower. The energy release is steadier. You don't get the same sudden rush followed by the same sharp drop. And if you are a senior watching this matters even more than you may think. Big swings in blood sugar don't just affect your lab results. They affect your energy, your mood, your appetite, your balance, your cravings, and sometimes even your confidence. Now, before I reveal the flour I recommend most often, I need to show you the options people reach for in the real world, because not every alternative is equally good. Some are better than white flour but still easy to overtrust. Some are excellent in the right recipe but terrible in the wrong one. And one, in my opinion, stands above the rest for overall blood sugar friendliness. But if I give you that answer too early, you'll miss the reason why it works. So stay with me, because flour number one only makes sense after you understand why the others fall short. Let's start with the flour people think deserves a medal just because it's not white. Whole wheat flour. Is it better than refined white flour? Yes, usually. Is it harmless for blood sugar? No. And this is where many people get blindsided. Whole wheat flour keeps more of the grain than white flour does, which means more fiber and more nutrition. That is a genuine improvement. But it is still flour. It is still ground carbohydrate. And once wheat is finely milled, your body does not have to work very hard to break it down. That means the rise in glucose may be slower than white flour, but it can still be significant. I see this mistake constantly with people who have been told, switch to whole wheat and you're fine. No, not fine. Better, perhaps, but not fine by default. Let me tell you about Robert, 69. He gave up white toast and replaced it with dense whole wheat pancakes every morning. He was convinced he had fixed breakfast, but his after-meal numbers stayed stubbornly high. Why? Because he wasn't just eating whole wheat flour. He was eating a large portion of it, mixed with mashed banana and syrup, without enough protein on the plate. The label changed, but the glucose outcome barely improved. Whole wheat can help, but it is not the winner. Next comes oat flour, and this one deserves a more thoughtful conversation because oat flour actually has real strengths. Oats contain beta-glucan, a type of soluble fiber that can slow digestion and soften the post-meal rise in blood sugar. That is a meaningful benefit. This is one reason oats show up so often in heart-healthy and diabetes-friendly conversations. But here is where people get overexcited. Oat flour is still fairly carbohydrate-dense, and because it is ground into flour, it is processed further than intact oats. So the body gets easier access to those carbs. In other words, oat flour can be useful, but it is not a free pass. I like oat flour best when it's part of a blend, not when it is the whole strategy. Mixed with almond flour, flax meal, eggs, or Greek yogurt, it can work beautifully. Used alone in a giant stack of muffins you call healthy because they contain oats, that can go sideways very quickly. Helen learned this the hard way. She baked oat flour breakfast bars with honey, raisins, and dried cranberries, then cut herself what she called a modest square. That square was nearly a dessert wearing a wellness costume. Her glucose after breakfast told the truth. Oat flour has potential, but only when you respect the rest of the recipe. Now let's talk about buckwheat flour, because the name confuses people, and confusion creates bad decisions. Buckwheat is not wheat, it is actually a seed, and for many people it can be a smart alternative. It has a stronger, earthier flavor, and it tends to be more filling than refined flour options. Some people tolerate it quite well from a blood sugar standpoint, especially when used in savory crepes, modest pancakes, or blended recipes where the portion stays under control. But again, and this is where the pattern matters, a better does not mean invisible. If you turn buckwheat into a large pancake breakfast with sweet toppings, you can absolutely still spike. What I do like about buckwheat is that it often slows people down. It is not fluffy, blank, and easy to overeat the way white flour products are. It has character. It has substance. And sometimes food that makes you chew a little longer and feel a little fuller is already doing you a favor. But buckwheat is not the flour I would crown as best overall for diabetics who want the gentlest glucose response. It is more of a middle ground choice. Useful, respectable, sometimes excellent, but not the top recommendation. For that, we have to move toward flours that bring more protein, more fiber, and less digestible starch to the table. That brings us to chickpea flour, and now we are entering much more interesting territory. Chickpea flour, also called garbanzo bean flour or gram flour, is one of the options I genuinely like for people with diabetes, especially if they enjoy savory foods. Because compared with many grain flours, it brings more protein and fiber, which helps slow the blood sugar effect of the carbohydrates it contains. It also tends to be more satisfying. You eat it and feel like you ate something real. That satiety matters because one of the fastest ways to lose blood sugar control is to keep eating foods that leave you hungry 30 minutes later. But chickpea flour comes with a warning most people never hear. It is not a wonderful substitute for every sweet-baked recipe. If you try to make delicate vanilla cupcakes and pretend chickpea flour will disappear into the background, you may be deeply disappointed. It has personality. It leans savory. Where it shines is in flatbreads, savory pancakes, batters, protein-rich wraps, and rustic baked dishes where you actually want depth. One of my patients, Denise, replaced her lunchtime crackers with small chickpea flour flatbreads and hummus. Her afternoon cravings dropped, her after-lunch readings improved, and for the first time in months she stopped prowling the kitchen at 4 o'clock. Now let's move to coconut flour, which is one of the most misunderstood flours on the list. Coconut flour is very high in fiber and typically used in much smaller amounts than regular flour because it absorbs so much liquid. That high fiber content can be helpful. The smaller quantity used in recipes can also be helpful. And for some people, coconut flour performs beautifully in diabetes-friendly baking. But here is the problem. People hear low carb, and their brain stops working. They start assuming bigger portions do not matter. They assume every coconut flour cookie is a health food. That is exactly how good intentions become bad numbers. Coconut flour is not a cup-for-cup substitute for white flour. If you swap it blindly, your recipe can become dry, dense, and almost impossible to enjoy. Then people add more sweetener, more fat, more chocolate chips, more whatever it takes to rescue the texture, and suddenly the diabetes-friendly recipe becomes a calorie bomb that still doesn't taste very good. So while coconut flour can absolutely be part of a blood sugar-conscious kitchen, I rarely tell people it is the single best all-purpose answer. It is more of a specialist, very useful in the right hands, in the right recipe, in the right amount. Just not the universal winner. Before I reveal the flour I recommend most often, I need to tell you about one ingredient that is not always used alone, but deserves serious respect: ground flaxseed, sometimes called flax meal. Technically, some people use it more like an add-in than a full flour replacement, but do not underestimate what it can do. Flax brings fiber, healthy fats, and structure. It can lower the overall blood sugar impact of a recipe simply by displacing more starchy flour. If someone insists on baking with oat flour or whole wheat flour, one of my favorite moves is to add flax meal to the mixture. It changes the nutritional math in a very helpful direction. And now we arrive at the flour I recommend most often when a patient asks me, "Doctor, if I want the gentlest blood sugar response, where should I start?" My answer, more often than not, is almond flour. Not because it is trendy, not because it is fashionable, and not because social media says everyone should eat like a keto influencer. I recommend almond flour because compared with conventional flour options, it is much lower in digestible carbohydrate and naturally brings protein, fiber, and healthy fats into the meal. That combination slows everything down. If your goal is minimizing the glucose surge, almond flour usually gives you the strongest starting point. This is also why almond flour so often ends up at the top of these conversations among clinicians, dietitians, and health writers. It is not perfect. It is calorie dense. It can produce heavier textures. It is not appropriate for people with nut allergies. But from a blood sugar perspective, it consistently gives people a better chance than white flour, and often a better chance than whole wheat or oat flour used alone. I have seen this again and again in real kitchens. A patient swaps a wheat-based breakfast muffin for a small almond flour version paired with eggs, and suddenly the meter stops yelling at them. That is not magic. That is physiology. Let me tell you about Eleanor, 75, because her story changed the way she looked at breakfast forever. Eleanor loved baking. For years she made bran muffins and believed bran alone protected her from spikes. But her numbers after breakfast kept rising higher than she expected. We changed one thing. We replaced the grain-heavy muffin with a smaller almond flour muffin, reduced the sweetener, added walnuts, and paired it with plain Greek yogurt. Same ritual, same warm breakfast feeling. Completely different response. Her energy stayed steadier, her hunger was quieter, and her meter finally matched the story she thought her breakfast had been telling all along. That is what the right flour can do. But now I have to warn you about the most dangerous misunderstanding in this entire conversation. The best flour can still fail you if you build the rest of the recipe badly. Almond flour brownies drowned in maple syrup are still brownies. Coconut flour pancakes stacked 3 inches high and covered in banana, honey, and chocolate are still a blood sugar event. Chickpea flatbread eaten with protein and vegetables is one thing. Chickpea cookies the size of your face are another. People focus on the flour because it feels like the hero, but your blood sugar sees the entire meal, not just the ingredient you were proud enough to tell your doctor about. So what ruins even the best flour? Portion blindness. That is the hidden mistake. Not the flour itself, the amount, the toppings, the extras. The idea that if something is diabetic-friendly, more must be better. I have watched people turn a smart swap into a glucose disaster simply because they stopped paying attention the moment they bought the healthier bag. This is why blood sugar management is so often lost in the space between intention and quantity. You can choose the best flour on earth, but if you bake a giant loaf, cut a thick slice, spread it with jam, and call it discipline, your pancreas will not applaud you for your optimism. There is another trap, and if you shop for health foods, you have seen it. Flour blends marketed as keto, low-carb, multigrain, high-protein, or diabetic safe. Some are genuinely decent. Some are nonsense in a prettier package. This is why I want you to stop reading the front of the bag and start reading the nutrition label and ingredient list. Look at total carbohydrate per serving. Look at fiber. Look at protein. Look at serving size, because that is where companies play games. And look at the first few ingredients. If the first ingredients are refined starches, rice flour, tapioca starch, or other quick carbs, the front label may be telling you a bedtime story. Tapioca flour, cassava flour, white rice flour, and many gluten-free blends are where a lot of people accidentally get into trouble. They assume gluten-free means blood sugar friendly. Absolutely not. Gluten-free only means gluten-free. Some of these flours behave very quickly in the body and can raise glucose more than people expect. I am not saying they are forbidden forever. I am saying they should never be confused with the best options for diabetes. If you have been buying gluten-free crackers and breads and wondering why your numbers still jump, the answer may be sitting in the fine print of the flour blend, not in your willpower. Now I want to give you something even more valuable than a ranking. I want to give you a decision rule, because that will help you every time you shop. If you want the best blood sugar response, choose a flour that does at least one of these three things well, and preferably all three. It lowers the digestible carbohydrate load, it raises the fiber and protein, and it keeps the portion realistic because the food is filling enough that you naturally stop sooner. Almond flour does that very well. Chickpea flour does that fairly well. Coconut flour can do that in certain recipes. Refined white flour does almost none of it. And remember this, because it will save you from a lot of confusion. Flour does not act alone. The same flour behaves differently depending on what sits beside it. Add eggs, Greek yogurt, nuts, seeds, or a little nut butter, and the meal often lands more gently. Add syrup, juice, jam, sweetened dried fruit, and a giant serving, and the rise becomes much sharper. That's why some people swear a flour is wonderful, while others say it sent their sugar through the roof. They may both be telling the truth. They are just eating completely different meals built on top of the same flour. If you are asking me for a simple ranking, the way I would explain it to a patient in clinic is this. The worst common choice for blood sugar control is refined white flour, and the products built mainly from it. Slightly better but still easy to overestimate is whole wheat flour. Oat flour can be useful, especially in blends, but still needs caution. Buckwheat can be a smart middle option. Chickpea flour is one of the stronger blood sugar choices, especially for savory foods. Coconut flour can be excellent in the right recipe, but needs skill. And almond flour is the one I most often place at the top for overall glucose friendliness. Now there is one more thing I want you to hear, especially if you are older and you have been told to simplify your eating. Sometimes the best flour is not a flour at all. Sometimes the smartest diabetes-friendly meal is to stop trying to recreate bread, muffins, pancakes, and cookies every day, and shift toward foods that are naturally easier on blood sugar. Eggs with vegetables, Greek yogurt with nuts, cottage cheese and berries, lentil soup, salmon and salad. I know that is not as exciting as a miracle flour reveal, but it is honest. Flour swaps help most when they are used strategically, not when they become your whole identity. Still, if baking matters to you emotionally, if the comfort of warm bread or a morning muffin is part of your quality of life, I do not want you to feel deprived. I want you to feel informed. There is a huge difference. Deprivation creates rebellion. Information creates control. So if you love baking, keep baking, but become more selective. Use almond flour as your base more often. Use chickpea flour for savory creations. Blend in flax meal. Be careful with oat flour and whole wheat. Treat gluten-free starch blends with suspicion. And above all, stop assuming healthy-looking labels are doing the thinking for you. They are not. Let me give you the practical pantry strategy I teach. Keep one best base flour, one support flour, and one caution flour. Best base flour, almond flour. Support flour, chickpea flour, or flax meal depending on whether you bake savory or sweet. Caution flour, oat flour, or whole wheat used in smaller amounts when texture matters. And then make a rule that no recipe gets to call itself diabetes-friendly unless it also contains protein or healthy fat somewhere in the meal. That one rule solves more problems than you would believe. It forces you to stop thinking ingredient by ingredient and start thinking meal by meal, which is exactly how blood sugar actually behaves. I also want you to test, not guess. If you have a glucose meter or continuous monitor, let the data teach you. Try one recipe with almond flour. Check your glucose before you eat, and again, about 90 minutes to 2 hours later, following the plan your clinician has given you. On another day, try your usual whole wheat or oat flour version in the same portion, then compare. This is where myths go to die. Because once you see your own numbers, the debate becomes much simpler. Your body may tolerate one option beautifully and another one poorly, and that personal response is worth more than any internet argument. One of the most liberating moments for patients is when they realize they do not need to memorize 50 nutrition rules. They need a handful of honest principles. Less refined is usually better. More fiber and protein is usually better. Smaller portions are usually better. Pairing carbs with protein or fat is usually better. And believing the front of a package without verifying the label is usually worse. If you hold on to those principles, most shopping decisions become easier. A confusion starts to lift because you are no longer asking, is this food marketed to diabetics? You are asking, what is this food actually made of? And I need to say a word about cost, because almond flour is not cheap. Some viewers will hear me recommend it and feel defeated immediately. Please do not. If almond flour is too expensive, that does not mean you have failed. It means you need a strategy. Use almond flour for the recipes you eat most often, and use it in smaller blended amounts when needed. Chickpea flour may be more affordable. Flax meal can stretch a recipe. Even simply reducing your reliance on refined flour while increasing protein and vegetables can improve blood sugar control dramatically. Progress is not reserved for people with expensive pantries. For those of you with kidney disease, digestive issues, food allergies, or multiple medical conditions, this is where personal medical advice matters. A flour that works wonderfully for one person may not be ideal for another. Nut allergies make almond flour impossible. Some people do not tolerate large amounts of fiber comfortably. Some people need to be more careful with calorie density. This is why I teach principles first and rigid rules second. The goal is not perfection. The goal is finding the best realistic option for your body, your budget, and your kitchen. That is how sustainable blood sugar control is built. So after everything we have covered, what is the answer to the title of this video? The best flour for diabetics that tends to raise blood sugar the least, when used properly, is usually almond flour. That is my clearest answer. But the full answer is smarter than the headline. No flour is completely invisible to blood sugar. The best result comes from the right flour, the right amount, the right recipe, and the right meal around it. If almond flour is not right for you, chickpea flour and carefully used coconut flour are strong alternatives. Whole wheat and oat flour may be improvements over white, but they are not the top winners. Now let me leave you with the exact protocol I would use if I were helping you rebuild your pantry this week. Remove or reduce refined white flour products first. Choose almond flour as your main replacement if you can tolerate and afford it. Add chickpea flour for savory recipes. Keep flax meal for boosting fiber and lowering the starch load in recipes you already enjoy. Use oat flour or whole wheat flour with caution and in smaller portions. Avoid being fooled by gluten-free starch blends. Pair flour-based foods with protein. Watch your toppings. Test your response. If you do those things, your pantry starts working for you instead of against you. And let me tell you something that matters beyond glucose numbers. When people choose foods that keep blood sugar steadier, they often report more than better readings. They tell me their afternoons feel calmer, their cravings shrink, their energy stops collapsing at 3 o'clock. They stop feeling as if food is controlling the rhythm of their day. That is a bigger victory than any flour discussion, because the real goal is not winning an argument about almond versus oat. The real goal is protecting your energy, your heart, your brain, your independence, and your peace of mind. That is what every smart food decision is really buying you. If this video helped you see flour differently, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who is trying hard and still feeling confused by blood sugar spikes they thought they were avoiding. Subscribe if you want more straight, practical guidance without the nonsense and without the gimmicks. And the next time you stand in that grocery aisle holding a bag of flour and wondering whether it's helping or hurting, remember this. The healthiest label is not always the healthiest choice. The gentlest flour is usually the one that brings less starch and more substance. And more often than not, that flour is almond. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.